There are so many issues and there are so many factors that impact the way we eat. Our diet is influenced by so many different things, some of which we will have control over, some of it will not have no control over. At the moment, there is so much that is happening. It could be the economic issues that we are facing. It could be the wars that we are seeing, with some of those wars actually impacting on how much food is available or the distribution of food or the food supply chain. And so you might be impacted in one way or the other, or thinking about how literally the changes that are happening around us, be it the global warming or be it the factors to do with food insecurity, and how that impacts on how you are able to make food choices for yourself and your family. And so a colleague of mine has spent some time trying to write or other reviewing some of these factors and how they can actually impact on the presence or availability of food. And this is something that we have recently published, and I will really love to talk a little bit about it today. So this article that is referred to as we actually reviewed the impact of social disruptions on food security and food chain. Just if I look a little bit on the just the abstract or a summary of what you talked about, we have highlighted some things like, for example, COVID-19. We had all these restrictions, we had all these limitations, we had all these different things that actually impacted us. And you might be naive to think that the impact of COVID-19 is way behind us and we have moved on. But actually, there is so much that is still happening, and the food systems or the food supply chain is still actually trying to recover from that. There are also things to do with conflicts, things to do with wars. We've seen what is happening in Ukraine and what is happening currently in Israel, and how this impacts, because a lot of people, a lot of nations actually depend on some of these nations for their livelihood or the supply of their food. As if I take you just a little bit about some of the things that we looked at in terms of defining what is really food security, which is something that is basically availability of foods at all times to be able to meet adequately the world supplies of things like basic foodstuffs that are going to be able to sustain a steady expansion of food consumption, of course, which impacts everyone around us. And there are some of the factors that we looked at that can actually be able to impact or affect this food security or food supply chain. Things like food preferences, things like food choice, food preference, that is basically the attitudes that you express towards your food. Things like food choice, where you are actually being able to make that decision based on the access of these adequate resources that you need for your nutritious foods and diets. We've talked about things like famine, I'll come back to that in a minute, and things like food availability. So to take you through the many different things, so there are like all these different factors that can actually disrupt the food systems, and this can actually impact on food security. So if you're looking at these, basically broadly, we divided these into sociological factors, psychological factors, and then the marketplace or economic factors. Sociological factors include things like the buying habits, the level of income, the family size, the structure of the family. If in your family you have a little bit more income or disposable income, you will be able to buy more food. You will be able, maybe some people go into things like takeaway, etc., depending as compared to somebody whose level of income is much more smaller or squeezed. It gets to a point where, if, for example, at the moment there are so many changes, there's maybe in countries where it is even becoming much more expensive to buy basic food, and it gets to a point that you are thinking between, am I going to be able to buy food, or am I going to be able to pay fuel, or am I being able to kind of pay for the heating of my house and the bill of heating and things like that, and being able to compare these things and see how can that really impact on the availability of food, but also on your ability to be able to get a nutritious diet. There are things like psychological factors. These include perception of hunger. We know that perception of hunger, society levels, or appetite, they are impacted differently in different times, and they can actually be again impacted by all these different things happening around. For example, as the society goes into like aging and things like that, they can have an impact back on food choice and food availability, etc. And of course, there are also things to do with marketplace or economic issues, which can be like things like the income or the cost of food, education level of the head of the household. If you've got, let's say, the budget to be able, as I've already mentioned, to have extras to be able to afford, let's say, convenient food versus if you're not able to be able to get or afford convenient food. So we looked at these different factors here. Like, for example, we looked at the COVID-19, how COVID-19 impacted on food choices. And you might think, as I said, like COVID is in the past. I'm not going to bother much to talk about COVID-19. But remember that some of these disruptions can actually happen over time. There are like some of these pandemics that actually, if you trace back, they do have a tendency of reappearing. And it could be that COVID-19 is actually to the past, but it could be other things that might come in the future. And just being able to kind of proof the food chain or food supply or food system against some of these things is really important. And so we saw so many different things happening with COVID-19, which actually ended up impacting on the food choices and food behavior. If you're like me, during the pandemic, I went to my local supermarket to do some shopping. As I arrived in the supermarket, the shelves are empty. It was not just the tissue that was missing, but also all the foods like canned food or anything that you can think about. We don't normally consume long shelf life milk, but because of all the issues and all the shelves being empty, we were even desiring to get this long shelf life milk, and it wasn't on the store shelves because everybody was hoarding, everybody was kind of panic buying. And this is something that we see can be a social disruption that can actually exist as a result of all these different things that can't be things like pandemics. It could also be just like sometimes people love panic buying when it comes towards, like sometimes there have been Christmases where, like last year, there was the avian flu in the UK, and everybody was panic buying, and they're saying like there wasn't enough turkey for Christmas. It could be like those occasions that people are feeling threatened and they're feeling like something is happening to the food supply chain. There's something that is happening to the food system. And as a result of that, we need to protect ourselves. We need to protect our families. We need to protect our food system. And that's something that has hurt the potential of disrupting, and we've seen it disrupting our food system as a result of COVID-19. One of the things that I found quite interesting in the process of drafting all these was looking at it in terms of like some of the families ended up kind of in a way trying to eat more fruits and vegetables. If we look at here like the consumption of nutritious foods, some people ended up eating more nutritious foods, whereas other people actually reduced their consumption of more nutritious foods, particularly looking at things like fruits and vegetables. We know that if you are eating less fruits and vegetables, they can actually result in issues to do with your health, because fruits and vegetables are loaded with so much nutritional value that they can actually be impactful to you as a person, and this can actually impact your life in the longer term. So being able to have that access to nutritious food, being able to have that access to fruits and vegetables can have an impact on health, and particularly when it comes to things like infections like COVID-19, where it's something that your body is trying to fight, your body's immune function is trying to fight to be able to get itself back into recovery mode. And you need sometimes to be able to kind of enhance or boost the immune system, and things like fruits and vegetables are some of the most important things. And finding it difficult just to find fresh fruits and vegetables during the pandemic was an issue in itself and can also continue to be an issue depending on where you live and how you are able to access your food. And of course, we mentioned here that fruits and vegetables are considered to be key dietary components that are required, in particular when it comes to, again, if I just try to kind of like highlight that fruits and vegetables are considered to be key dietary components that are required to adhere to many nations' dietary guidelines, as they do make an important contribution to the intakes of dietary fiber, vitamins, minerals, as well as phytochemicals. And these have important roles that they play in the body. Not only can they protect the body against diseases or help to enhance the immune function, but also phytochemicals are rich in such a way that they can actually have things like antioxidants, and antioxidants are really good when it comes to kind of neutralizing reactive oxygen species. You don't need to do anything to have these reactive oxygen species. We live in a world where pollution is very common, and as a result of that, these reactive oxygen species are generated. And if you don't have something that will donate an oxygen that will be kind of in a way able to neutralize those reactive oxygen species, your body will start to produce that, and that can impact on your health. And so fruits and vegetables are important. We saw this becoming an issue where people were impacted with their ability to be able to choose healthy fruits and vegetables. Something interesting to note is that some of the people actually saw that in terms of what some people ended up having healthier food choices, where again at the end of the day there was like kind of a decrease in the consumption of things like sweet snacks and increase in the consumption of fruits and vegetables, because of course people were working more remotely, whereas other people actually showed also that unhealthy food choices, particularly things like increased alcohol consumption, was also seen. It's some people were working remotely. It became so normal, and I think even it's something that has become like a trend post-COVID. A lot of people are actually not going back into pubs to drink alcohol and things like that, but more supermarket sale of alcohol has increased because more people are finding it much more easier to consume alcohol in their own homes. And also we saw that this one of the things that was a bit interesting, looking at some of the countries which were severely impacted or affected. I'll try to find that severely impacted by the COVID-19, like Italy. There was again some of the increase in levels of consumption of alcohol, and that could actually just be seen as something that was kind of like a coping mechanism to try and help people to feel like they're coping a little bit more rather than anything else. So let's find out something to do with Italy, if I'll be able to see that in this work. Sorry, if I go back. Right, this is here. Looking at, for example, in Italy, where there was a 69% increase in alcohol consumption during the pandemic. And of course, looking at it, it was like one of those countries that happened to be most hit by the pandemic. And of course, people can actually use it as an option to kind of try a coping mechanism. But you know that that's just going to be like temporary coping mechanism, because as you're looking here, there are all these, like, for example, if you've got alcohol, so the increase in the consumption of alcohol linked to increasing level of stress, and so the alcohol is seen like a coping mechanism. But then alcohol consumption, on the other hand, is actually identified as a significant risk to things like illnesses, disability, and mortality. And that's something that again can result as a result of where people are finding it difficult to kind of cope with things like pandemics, etc., and that can impact on their food choice. So the first thing to think about again is the presence of things like pandemics and how this can actually impact on food choice and food behavior. The other thing to think about is conflict. So number 2 is conflict. So if you're trying to look at it here, again, if I just do it much more easier, maybe to search for it, you'll see going back into conflict affected. We know that at the moment it's not talked about, sadly, a lot, because obviously the war between Israel and Hamas has actually overtaken everything, and nobody is much more looking at things that are happening in Ukraine, for example. But if you're trying to look at that devastating war that has occurred between and continues to occur for quite a significant amount of time now, looking at particularly Ukraine and Russia, we've seen places where they have actually destroyed grains in the storage. There's been those bombarding and things like that, and that has actually meant some of the things that we could naturally find being exported around the world have actually become more difficult. There's been a time just around, I think, last Christmas, where it was much more difficult to find wheat flour on the shelves of supermarkets, because Ukraine is a significant producer of things like wheat, and of course people are not able to go and farm. When you see that a lot of grains being destroyed, etc., this has actually been an impact on not just like the Ukrainian people or Europe, where we depend on Ukraine to be able to source most of our grains, but also we've seen countries and around the globe, like places in Africa, where the shipment of this grain was interrupted, and this again impacts so many things. Looking at also like just the most sad part of the whole thing is that we actually heard a conflict, or the conflict literally followed COVID-19. So there wasn't like any differences in time scale between when COVID-19 had stopped and when the war began. So try to imagine when the global economy is trying to recover and the world is trying to kind of make sense of what COVID-19 has resulted in terms of economic issues, in terms of food supply chain, and then there is this war and there's this conflict, and sometimes also war can actually be used as a weapon against like people being able to get food, which is kind of really, really sad. And of course, looking here, we highlight starvation of civilians, which is something that is very frequent, right? Something that is very common when it comes particularly to when there are like all these wars, when there are conflicts and things like that. Look at the moment, if you look at the news and you're seeing what is happening in Gaza, I've seen like young children not being able to feed. I've seen like a mother was complaining and saying she had just given birth and baby was about 7 days old. And we know that the first 1,000 days are important in fetal programming, let alone the first 7 days. And this child was not able to be fed. She couldn't breastfeed. Obviously, breast milk has all these antibiotics, has got all the human milk oligosaccharides, which are really good, sugars that are really good for the health of the newborn baby. We have those immunoglobulins, which are passed to the child as the mother is suckling, as that child is suckling the mother, and that can actually program or set up the immune system of the child as they are born. But because of all these issues, because of conflict, because of war, if the mother is not able to breastfeed the child, they will result in things like formula feeding. But if it is something that has happened in a rush, where war doesn't tell you when the conflict is starting, the people of Gaza woke up in the body and there was bombardment. The people of Israel as well, they are having their party and there's bombardment. Nobody prepares you for that. So you will not say that I will go and stash my breast milk or stash my formula filled to be able to feed my child. And you see that sometimes civilians do starve, and when civilians are starving, that can actually also impact on the food choice and food behavior. Again, there have been places where people have actually used, when there is that conflict, you find that sometimes even unintentionally, it can be as a consequence of military activity, whereby you can find that some people end up having issues to do with warfare, resulting in insufficient nutrition, and some people can even die because of hunger and starvation, which was never intended, but just as a result of war. The other thing to think about, or the other C to think about, we've looked at the pandemic, COVID-19. We've looked at the conflict, so these are wars and things like that. And then the other thing that we looked at was climate changes. And looking at just generally, if I bring up next, right? If you're looking at all these changes in climate, there are places, I'll do sub-Saharan. See if we, if you look at what is happening in sub-Saharan Africa, just to highlight that, it's a very, how do you say, a very sad thing to think about, right? Which is one of those places and spaces where there's chronic food insecurity, which remains to be, of course, an endemic, and just trying to think about the threats of famine, trying to think about malnourishment. When you're watching news, you've just had a very fat dinner and you've eaten, and maybe some of the food has gone into the bin as the leftovers, and then you're sitting down to have 10 o'clock news. All of a sudden you see these images of children who are really starving, who are malnourished as a result of these climatic changes. And sadly, places like Somalia, which has continued to be on the top list in terms of the places and spaces where there's all these hunger and starvation, you find that recently there's been an outpour of rain, and it's been on the news where you're seeing floods and people are flooded in their homes, and you're trying to think about already what is happening in terms of the unavailability of food because it hasn't rained, so they can't be able to grow crops. And when it rains, the rain is just unbearable, and nobody knows how long that rain is going to stay to sustain any meaningful agricultural activities. And even if they were to grow some things today, how long does it take before the food will be ready for harvest? So climatic changes, we're talking about global warming, and if you're trying to look at the temperatures that are rising at the moment day after day, which are changing the ecosystem, making it much more difficult and much more different to find that some of the crops that will naturally thrive and survive given environments or environmental conditions, they are no longer able to survive, or you're finding different shifts and different varieties that will not necessarily be native to a different place because, of course, of all those impact of the climate and the global warming. So if you're trying to look at how does those three things in particular, the conflict, the pandemic or COVID-19, and the climatic changes, how do they impact on people's shopping habits and dietary behavior? Of course, we know the other thing I haven't talked about is the economic crisis, right? Those are the cash that is available to be able to use to buy the things that you are able to buy. Generally, we see that if you have got those consumers that have, let's say, low income, they will end up being not able to buy so many different things or the so-called healthy meals, because they will think like, of course, you're having issues in the end that you are able to eat and not able to eat what you need to eat, what not to eat, what and what not. And at the end of this day, you find that if you've got this squeeze, and it's something that we've highlighted here, if you've got that squeeze on food or the availability of the food, you end up finding that people will end up moving towards like different kinds of products. They will have low quality items. They'll eat more processed foods. And there will also be also competition between the balance of the food budget and other things like fuel costs, cost of heating homes, cost of life, and things like that. And this can actually impact and also result in the health issues, because again, if you're looking at this, if you're having those ultra processed foods, ultra-processed foods, as we've highlighted here, which are basically minimally processed or more ultra-processed food, they can actually impact on the health, and they can have impact on these so-called non-communicable diseases or NCDs, comorbidities, and this can result into a significant increase or a significant raise or increase in things like cardiovascular diseases, depressive symptoms, type 2 diabetes, mellitus, which is something, again, it's more to do with insulin resistance, and is impacted with things like obesity, things like cancer that have been linked again to this ultra processed food. And these are some of the things, again, to think about. Sometimes people can often go to things like the so-called comfort foods. And when you go to these comfort foods, they can be as a result, again, of feeling like there's so much happening in terms of economic issues, economic crunch. I'm not able to afford this. I'm going to go to eat maybe something that will help me in things like chocolate, ice cream, to kind of comfort myself for a little while. And that in the end can impact on health of a person. So that sounds like really gloom. It sounds like really terrible. It sounds like really bad. And you're thinking, so how can we be able to have a better livelihood or a better life despite of what is happening in terms of these conflict, in terms of the economic issues, in terms of the pandemics, in terms of the climate issues? So we've looked at some strategies that can actually be used so that you can still be able to have a healthy food in despite of the economic, environmental, or shifts in political systems around the world, which of course is something that we will continue to see whether we like it or not. Number one of the things to think about is, we've talked about things to do with food waste here, and food is, I don't know how to say this, but of course it's a paradox. I feel sometimes sad to talk about it, where, as I mentioned, once you've just had your dinner and you've seen, like you've heard, food to spare that some has gone in the bin, you turn on the news and you see this malnourished child who will be dying. And it's a shame, because every single minute, every single second as you speak, somebody around the world will lose their life because of starvation and hunger and malnutrition, whereas we have a lot of food. Like I was reading an article the other day, and they were saying if food waste was a country, it will be the third largest country in the world, where you're seeing all these different things, and you're seeing the people that are dying every single day could actually make use of the food that we are wasting. And so maybe one of the things that we can do is try to think of ways in which we can value, right, all our leftovers, giving the leftovers a second chance, revaluing leftovers as a conduit of disposing of our surplus food. If you've cooked rice, right, and you're not able to eat everything, instead of putting it in the bin, why can't you think of the second day having your rice and then making a rice salad out of the rice rather than it going into the bin? If you've cooked a lot of, let's say, turkey, Christmas is coming, instead of taking it and thinking like it's a leftover, why not slice it into smaller pieces, portion it, put it in the freezer, get it out just what you need, and you can make a sandwich with the turkey, or make like a salad with the turkey, rather than wasting that food, right? The other thing that you can think about of doing, again, is in a way trying to think about some of these canned foods. Most of the time I've heard people saying, well, I can never eat canned food, it's not healthy. Of course, there are issues to do with canned food, don't get me wrong. Things like if you're having canned meat, trying to think about N-nitroso that can actually form, which is a carcinogen or something that can cause cancer, but it actually cannot result due to canning not being done correctly. But the chances of that happening are very slim. But things like canned soup, canned fruit, canned vegetables, they have actually been seen to be nutritious, and they can be available all year round. You don't need to wait for seasonality to be able to find this food. things like frozen fruits and vegetables, they are actually frozen prime at the time of harvest, and they tend to maintain the nutritional value over time. And so do not shy away from frozen fruits and vegetables and think I just have to go for the fresh fruits and vegetables. The other thing to think about is, again, things like household shopping basket. You can think of, instead of going for my brand, you can go for the basics of the shop. And when you're getting those cheaper cheaper options than the branded items, the shops can actually give you those cheaper options, and don't be shy to go for those, right? You can as well think of things like, in general, adopting a more like plant-based diet where you're eating more vegetables, more legumes, which will have more protein, but they will be much more cheaper compared to the option of you buying meat. And of course, you still need your meat for their bioavailability and biodigestibility, but something to think about again. Then the other thing that I will talk about, so that I can stop talking about this in a minute, is just, again, being able to diversify your food, so that you're not just eating something that is more, one fit all, but you can as well diversify what you eat, and also trying to grow your own. You might not necessarily need a lot of patches of land to be able to have like a small kind of plot where you can grow your own salad leaves. You can grow things like carrots, cucumbers, which are really, really easy to grow. And this can actually include participation where you can engage households, right? We're talking about, you can encourage your children to do this, looking after the crops together, being able to kind of, in a way, care for them together. And that might take a little bit more time before you are able to get those harvests. But when you get it with minimal effort, you can actually be able to eat healthy, and also be able to kind of, in a way, cheaper eating, where you don't really necessarily end up to find issues with supply and things like that. There are also, of course, developed countries where we know that things like in the UK, there have been talks about free school meals. If you have access to that, why not utilize it? So at the end of the day, what we conclude is that some households can actually be impacted, and they can end up having unhealthy food choices, where sometimes you don't have choice over that, right? But at the end of the day, trying to think of several coordinated policies that can actually ensure access to healthy diets and foods, such as where governments can invest in programs that allow continual production and distribution of foods, even in times of restrictions or in conflict, so that we have resilient food systems, right? And the food industry also needs to come up with processes and food production practices that are more resilient to the ever emerging issues that have the potential of disrupting the food supply chain. And of course, at the end of the day, we're trying to ensure that we are meeting with the with the UN sustainable goals, which is something that everybody is talking about, sustainability, but also being able to have those sustainable development goals met at the end of the day.